Hello, Andre. How are you doing?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Well, actually, for you, I think it's already afternoon, right?
Yeah, it's afternoon. It's afternoon. Yes,
Yep. Good
2:30 p.m.
afternoon.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, Andre. But before we go into more deep dive, let me just quickly introduce you to audience, and then I'll hand it over mic to you.
That's okay.
So
Thank you.
I think couple of folks, those who are actively involved in the community past couple of years, I think for those, I don't think so. Your introduction is required because they are seeing day and day activity what you are giving to a community across blogs and the response to user groups and all the communities, right? So just to give you a quick background, so Andre is Dynamics 365 typically business apps MVP, and he's an expert in FNO technical side. And you might have seen he's actively involved and helping the Dynamics community across blogs, any user group sessions everywhere. Today's session mainly on the advanced tips on data entity developments, and you might have seen as the integration platform is becoming rich and day by day, there is always demand from a customer that how can we expedite my integration activity, right? So I'm sure in today's session, what Andre is going to help us to understand the simplified approach that any developer should understand, digest quickly, and try to implement for their implementation, right? So with that, Andre, I will request you to start your introduction and help us to understand what you're going to showcase today.
Okay. Well, thank you. And let me start with greet you all in your own language. Namaste. Today I will talk about the advanced tips for data entity development in Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. Some people might have worked with the human resource app. I noticed that also Parag Chapres is in the call. He can also take advantage when the HR apps will be moved back into the finance operations platform. He can use the same experience as we do with the data entity development going forward when it's moved back in the system. Well, actually, there was already a good introduction from myself. Um, a bit more information. Currently working as a product manager at Two Greece, where we develop ISV solutions and also have a subsidiary in India. So when I was asked by Rakesh to do a session for this event in India, then I thought, well, I can't say no. I have to do it. Um, a brief introduction of my career, and I did not mention anything about just the employers, but more what I did do and how I got my current knowledge. In 1996, I graduated from school and directly started at a very small company in the Netherlands who had the Navision Financials solution just acquired as the base for building their vertical solutions and have a Windows story. So it was already as at the start of my career, I worked with the Dynamics stack, what it is today. Um, I got my first introduction to Damgard Axapta first 1.0 in 1998. I still have the CD-ROM to install the solution. It's quite funny. And in 2001, I made the switch to Dynamics, or at that time, Damgard Axapta, and started implementing the 2.5 version and later with all the other versions later on. I moved to an end customer in 2009, and then I also looked at the community and also started to contribute. At that time, I stopped later on when I moved to another employer again because the account was not the same anymore. And later, I thought, well, I have to start again. It was around 2011, 2012, which also just Microsoft noticed it and they awarded me with an MVP award, which I'm quite proud of to get it. And just blogged more and more and more. And in 2019, when I switched also from employer, I decided to move everything to a personal blog site, which is now dynamicspedia.com. Moved also copied all the content which I had, and this year I can celebrate my 25 years Dynamics experience. I'm still eager to just share all my knowledge or learnings and continue to do that in the coming years. Well, this is a bit too quick. Today I will briefly talk about the basics, how to build your first data entity in the system, then some next steps, what can we do to just add some related tables or extend the data entities with certain virtual columns. Also a bit of attention to what an end user can experience when you develop a data entity in the system, and also how to deal with query fields and images, how you can use those type of fields also in your data entities. When looking at the data entities itself, it's requiring development effort, whereas as at To-Increase, we also have a solution where we can configure all integrations without the need for the data entities. We can utilize them, but can also live without them. But if you look at the world, the majority is trying to first look at the data entities and see how they can create the export and import experience, or probably integrations with other applications. Let's start with the basics of creating a new entity in the system. When we create a new entity, we will get an entity wizard. Then we can select certain properties like what's the primary data source. Do we want to enable a public API that is intended to tell the system, do I want to use the same data entity also for OData? Then we can use it with the Excel add-in or other OData in integrations, or even use an entity for the dual write, for example, or with the Power Automate. When we selected certain properties, we can also, in the second step, select the fields, also from some related tables. If you click on the data source and there are related tables, you can select some of them already, or add additional data sources, or also add some virtual fields as a base. For the virtual fields, you need to do something in addition. I will come back to that part later on. Some best practices, at least if you have a custom table, make sure that the table has an alternate key. It should have a network key and a primary key where the data management would know what would be the primary key fields to be able to determine if a record can be updated or if there's the need to insert a certain record. And also, when looking at the public names, like the public entity name and the public collection name, make sure that they are unique. You can actually also copy a data entity, an existing data entity, and continue making your changes, or you can extend one. But if you copy a data entity, make sure that those public names are unique. And also the same is valid for a label, which can be changed later on as well. If you have not unique names, then an end user can experience some issues when they try to open a list page in finance and operations. Could be not related to the data entity or just the table used in the data entity you created, but it can give just an error that and the form won't open. So if you did some development on a data entity and user is, after you publish those changes, experiencing some issues, first look at those public names. It might be causing your issue. As a result, for the data entity wizard, you get a data entity object, but also a staging table and already the security privileges. Let me quickly show you in the system how we can create the new entity. I already prepared a solution for today with some advanced data entities. When we click on Add New Item, can choose for a data model for some limitations, limiting the options. Then the data entity, we can provide a name, for example, the event location, security, user. There's a kind of best practice also for the naming. If you start a new entity, you can work, for example, with a prefix like DINPET from Dynexpedia, what I'm using quite often, and it should end with entity. So make sure that when you have the name, you also have a correct prefix and also the suffix entity. Then click on Add. Then it will initiate some values and will come with a wizard soon. And on the days that you needed it most, it will take a bit longer. It's still loading. Here it is. Now we can select a primary data source. That could start event location, security, user mapping. Then click on Next. It will, at this stage, check certain conditions if that primary data source table is meeting all the requirements like that alternate key. And on the Add Fields, we can select all the fields or just those ones we want to have. If there are some foreign relations already defined, you can select the data source to look at other related tables, or you can add the data source and provide certain joins. And then also from the other table, select certain additional fields. There's one additional option is convert the labels to field names. If you now look at the data entity field name, it's saying the user ID, the event location ID, and the data area ID, which are quite technical names. If a user is looking at the application instead of the event location, he will see, for example, the label warehouse. So if you want to help the user, you can click on the convert labels to field names, and then it will use the event location ID, but in the data entity, it will be called the warehouse, and for the data area ID, it will be called the company. You can select which fields are mandatory or not, then click on Finish, and it will create your data entity. The next steps would be just looking at everything to be completed. For example, it is creating the staging table. So if you try to save it or do some checks, it will give you a lot of best practice warnings, like fill the data, the title fields, and more. Also, the security privilege is created. Make sure that you provide a label to help the user understand what is this security privilege about. And also the data on the data entities, you can also manage certain properties. But I will show those properties later again. Move back to the presentation. For extending an entity, you can choose to take an existing entity, for example, then create an extension. Make sure you first have a model reference to the application suite in the example of the customer feed 3 entity, or if there's another model, if the entity belongs to another model, make sure in your own extension model you have referenced that model, otherwise it will not work. For example, what you can do for the customer v3 entity, add an additional field. What you have to do then is also extend the data entity with that new field, but also not only the data entity, you also have to update the staging table and add that field as well. And if you add the additional field on the staging table, make sure it has the same data type. For example, if you add a string field, well, let me show it directly. If you go to the customer entity, tables, it's not the data entities. Where's my entity v3? Here's the one. So what I did do as a preparation, I created a table extension. Let me open this one. Where I added one new field. Quite easy one. It's called my extension, and this my extension is a string field. And for now, I did not use an extend data type, but the string size is 20. So if we want to extend the customer v3 entity, we have to create an extension, and this is working when you have the model reference. Otherwise, it will suggest only the create extension in new projects. If you don't have this one enabled, in that case, you are missing the model reference. Then you first have to update your model with referencing, in this case, the application suite, and then you can continue. Now I created a new data entity extension. When I open this one, in the data source for the cust tables, you will also find that new field already. My extension, that one can be added to the list of fields. But just drag and drop it. Come on. To the fields node. On the data entity itself, we have the my extension field, but we also have to extend the related staging table. Find that one with almost the same name, the customer. Staging. Also create an extension of it. So we can open the table extension. And here we have to add the new field. With string. And now we can also define the name with my extension. Don't take care now of the correct properties, that it could cut the 20 characters from the base table into the staging with only 10 characters. So we have to make sure that we are using the same entity or the same data type, or at least the same string size. Now we can also save all the values, build the model. And only building the model is not sufficient. We also have to synchronize the database, as during the database synchronization, it will also create a view in the SQL database for that data entity. Now for the next steps, probably you want to add some fields for related tables or virtual fields. When you have an own data entity, or probably if you want to extend an existing data entity, you can in your own entity or the extension, you can add also data sources and select a certain join, and then also add fields from that related table. That's quite an easy process to do as well. But in that case, you will add some physical fields in the system, but there are also options to include virtual fields. And those fields need to have a certain Express Plus logic, or it could be a computed field where you get some additional details with an additional SQL statement. So there are two options supported by Microsoft. Also depends on a bit on your preference and how to get the data. If someone is having a huge knowledge on SQL, then probably the computed field might be easier to achieve. And with the virtual field, you can use any X++ logic you like. There is some documentation how to do it from Microsoft, and it's telling you exactly what to do in case of a computer column or the virtual field, what are the differences, and also what steps to do, with also examples. So if you want to add computed fields or fields with Express logic, I would recommend to read this documentation, as it's really good and helps you in understanding how to do it. The only addition I want to give here, a kind of best practice, if you're using the SQL option, it's faster for the performance. Because it can be at that time do a set-based query on the SQL server itself, whereas if you are using the X++ logic, it will turn into a row-by-row execution, which makes the data entity performing much slower. And also some data entities out of the box provided by Microsoft, they sometimes have, for example, 50 or more tables or database calls to be done for one single record, and those are really not performing. The worst experience I had myself with a standard data entity was by updating the workers at one company. They went live, also including some HR features, and we forgot one single field, and to update that field on about 1,400 records for their employees. The data management was just, it seems like it was stopped and frozen. We couldn't find out the real issue. Then I did the same with Power Automate, as there was also, the data entity was public available. Let it run, and at the end it took 4 hours to complete, changing or just updating one single field on 1,400 records. The list was in an Excel file. Power Automate could read that Excel file within 1 second, and really the remaining time was all about 6-7 seconds at least for each record for updating one single field. So really take care of making it lean and mean, and try to avoid Express logic, as that could cause real performance issues. Also, what I will not really elaborate on today, also you can use some additional methods supported for your data entity. There's no extensive documentation available on the internet when to use what methods, but however, I would say just look at the existing data entities in the system to learn, for example, during insert, how to deal with number sequences, or when you import one single field with some concatenated values, how to extract it and divide it into multiple fields. That can all be done, and there are plenty of examples in the standard data entities for that one. Another special method to be used is for actions on OData. What you can do is create an X++ method in a system which could do a certain action. There's documentation available from Microsoft how to do it. In my opinion, that one is also quite clear. And I also provided one blog from Adria Ariste, and he made an example where he also mentioned how to post, for example, a sales order using OData. So it's quite interesting to look at those, at the documentation and the example from Adria. Now come to the user experience. What I meant to say over there is an end user will have to work with the system. So if you look at the data entity label, that one should be clear enough for the user and not just my table entity, but explain, for example, it's about the rules for dynamically assigning the roles to users, or it's the security duty metadata customizations. As you notice, I'm quite interested in everything that's related with the security in finance operations and previous versions. So it's quite kind of favorite topic for me. But ensure that the data entity label is clear for the users, but also that the same is valid for the public names. Don't use something like a GUID, but a kind of meaningful name, so also an end user could understand if he sees a certain name, what it is about. Is it about customers? Is it about the security duties, or about released products? And also earlier mentioned already today, convert labels to field names will also help the end user understanding what fields to map from an Excel file to import data, for example, but also when it got exported, when it is seen, for example, warehouse, then the user will understand it. If the user will see invent location, then he thinks it might be a location in the warehouse instead of the warehouse itself. In addition, when building the data entities, we can also improve the search experience for the user by looking at some properties for the module, the tag, and the entity category. If the user will add multiple entities in the system, he will also have an additional help to search for an entity name. So that's why the entity label should be clear enough. You can also search for an application module. And as you see in the screenshot, I created an additional module, and I will also show you how to do that in the application yourself. You can add some tags that can be semicolon separated. Also an example here, the security and query and security to file. That will be a difference for the next topic of my presentations. And you can also define an entity category. Is it a master document, or what type of table is it related? So if someone wants to do just a conversion of the master data, and he doesn't really know what entity to use, if it's this one with customer or the other one, then he can also have an additional look at the entity category, and then it might be, hey, this one is a master, the other one is transaction. If he wants to do an integration with the master, he can just do an additional filter on that one. Quickly show you also the search results in the application. So if we have an export, a new export project, for example, and India demo, then when a user will click add multiple, then he will have the experience to search on the entity name or the application module. And when I now select the application module on Dynamicspedia, they will see the two which I prepared for today. And I will come back to that one later, as that will export a query. Or you can also filter on the tags, like to file, that it will show you only one. Security without the spelling error. And if we remove the application module, then we get all data entities related to security in this search. Now we can select certain data entities to be included, add them, and close it. So this is quite easy option for the end users to find your entities. Now, how to do it from a technical point of view? I'll go back to my development environment. I will take the data entity, the first one, for the assignment of the rules. If we are on the main node of the entity itself, you can see all the values here, like provide a certain label. If we do it with a label, then you can also translate it into multiple languages. And for the module itself, I have chosen here DIN-PAT. There's no lookup here. So in fact, you can try to type everything you like. However, there's a certain restriction which values are actually taken into consideration by the application. So how to know that DIN-PAT is related to Dynamicspedia? That one is related to an enumeration in the system, which is also extensible. Let me show that one. The enumeration itself is called DMF module, and I created an extension here to add my DIN-PAT, and DIN-PAT has a label of Dynamicspedia. So if we want to assign the correct module, if you have a new entity in the accounts payable part, you can search in the DMF module enumeration what is the value for the accounts payable. If you want to create another one, just create an extension and you can use your own module in the system. For the second one, we have to go to the tags. We can use one or multiple values separated by the semicolon. And for the category, where I showed you, you can use, for example, filter on the master, but there are more options like, is it a configuration, is it a transaction, and a reference and parameter, or what type of table is it? So those properties are set on the data entity itself. Now for queries and images, how to do it. If you look at the application, when Microsoft released the cloud version, then there were not that much of entities where images or attachments were supported. They created at least one at that time with the persons for a picture and the release products with the picture, but it was all extending a kind of base entity for attachments. But how to do it in the system yourself, at least you have to consider the field in the database is a container field, can contain a blob with the actual picture. What you have to ensure is that same field will be converted as string with a memo type, so an unlimited string to have the real value in binary language. Then you can also choose, do I want to have that value in my exported file, or do I want to use a resources folder? So for this one, I created two examples. One is just having the query in this file, and another one where the query or probably an attachment could be in the resources folder, and in this Excel file there will be a reference with the file name in the resources folder itself. me show you how you can create such data entities yourself. If you look at the first data entity, this is quite small table with a number of fields, but we have one field which is called rule query here. And in the data entity itself, you can use the rule query field like any other field. There's no difference, just select that field and it will be here available. However, if you have the staging table, if you're using the entity wizard, it will create that staging table already for you. Let me open this one. In the staging table, it will also create the same field with a container type. Then what you have to do is delete that field and add the field again with the same name as a string, as a field string. Then in the field string, you can select the string size to a memo. And in that case, it can convert automatically the picture or your query. It will copy it also to your data entity. And you can just export and import the same values. Let me show you the result of this when we now run this export project. I selected both of the options. And by default, it will now run via the batch framework, so it might take a while, just probably a minute to execute those records. We can directly refresh. We see that the first one is currently executing. And also the second one. It mentions partially succeeded. That's something I have to check myself. Not sure what I did wrong, but actually it did export all the records. Now it's complete. Then I can download the package. Well, actually there's one difference and also consideration when to choose for the resources or when to choose for the details in the file. If you expect really large attachments, like a huge PowerPoint presentation or a large picture, then probably the file format itself will be exploded. And if you export it to Excel, there are limitations, then it will probably cut off a part of it. So in that case, it's better to use the resource folder to have it as separate files. However, if you have it as separate files, in that case, you don't have the information available in a single file. So when looking at the queries itself, it might perfectly fit in the file itself instead of the resource folder. And then in that case, you can just download the single file and you have directly the Excel file. And in this case, I will download the package to get all the details. And what you'll see is initially looking at the file size, there's also a difference. The file where all the queries are included, it's larger compared to the one where it only has a reference to file name in the resources folder. I'll first open the one where the query is included. And what you can see is the query value itself, the binary value is just added in the Excel file. Make sure that you indeed use the string size memo, otherwise it might be cut off, and when you import the details, it will then give some errors on runtime that there's a bad query, and bad query means that it got not imported completely and it can't understand what it is about. Then the second one has the option for a file name. It has a certain additional field in it with the file name itself as a reference. and then the same file name can be found in the resources folder. For example, this one. I will open it with the notepad, and then it has it all exported also in a binary format. And when you import it, make sure that then again the files are in the resources folder. In this zip file, which includes the manifest and package header, some detail files, and all files in your resources folder in a structured way. Now, how to get the resources folder and the files moved into that one. It's also quite interesting. When I was looking at the differences, how Microsoft did it themselves, actually the track is only on the staging table. So the data entity itself is the same. Then you have the same fields, the rule query, definition group, etc. selected. But the difference is really on the staging table, where not only there's a field for that rule query, but also another field, rule query file name, and that should extend the data type file name, and that's not literally file name, but ensure the string size is large enough to have a file name in it. If you leave it to the default option, 10 characters, it will cut off, and you might experience or encounter some issues when on export it will try to generate GUID IDs. Well, and half GUID ID could lead to some duplicates as well, and then you have a certain data loss on exporting it. So make sure the string size is large enough. Then only this file name field is not sufficient. You also have to add a small piece of coding. Also on the staging table. And the method is called get fields to be converted to file. If you are using this method, you can provide the data entity field, the staging field for that query field or an attachment, and also what is the file name field related to this query field. So this is it's just a return value, in this case with one field, but as you see 2 brackets, you can also add multiple fields. So if you have one table with 2 queries or 2 images, in that case you can also extend this one with a comma and a second container. Then you can use multiple ones. Now there's one thing in addition which I would like to mention. When you create a new data entity, then at least I mentioned you have to use tables where it can find a natural key. Well, in some scenarios, the tables doesn't have it, like customer transactions, and then you can have some issues. Now, let me create a new entity. How to bypass that one? Table, I need to create a data entity. Apologies, almost wrong. Cust transactions entity. I want to add this one. When we select the cust trans table, you can actually see it here. It could be in transaction category. Next, and now it says, well, the natural key for the table cust trans was not found. But there was a small trick to get around this one. What you can do is provide the name of the data entity and also the public entity names and staging names as you would like to have it created in the application. And just take another table like the cust group, temporary, which can create the data entity for you. Not sure why it's taking that long. Try to click next. I think there's something in the backend not running correctly. Let's wait for 10 seconds. Otherwise I will just try a second session. Oh, there it is already. So instead of all, just a check in between. Am I still audible? Just quickly add one field, for example. It will create data entity with customer transactions. It will also create the privileges, and it will create the staging table. So what we can do now is just delete the data source customer group and also delete the fields which got selected here and build it from scratch by adding a new data source using the customer transactions table. But ensure you will set this one to read-only yes, as you are not able or not allowed to import records in the customer transactions directly in the system. So this ensures that you can only export data and refresh certain things. And when you have this customer transaction, you can use any field you like, add it to the list of fields. Which is always quite important. Add it to the list of fields. Also, one additional tip. There's a node with the field groups and an auto report. If you fill this auto report with the fields you think that a user will need, it will have all those fields by default selected when you're using, for example, the Excel add-in. So if you are using the open in Excel experience in finance operations, it will use the auto report for the list of fields to be used when opening that Excel file, including the entity for this table. If you don't define it, then it might be or empty or just some title fields in it. So with the auto report, you can also change that experience for the users. The entity key should have at least a valid field. So for example, we can use the voucher field. Now there's one issue, as it might be quite some work to update also the staging table. However, there's a feature in the system on the data entity itself, you can use the right-click button and regenerate the staging table with the information you have now. So if you now open the customer transaction staging table, it will list also all the fields you selected in your data entity. So it's not that type of work to bypass the limitation of using only tables with the natural key. You can use any table you like. The same is also valid if you are creating a new data entity and you want to use some system tables like I did with the security. In that case, also first create the data entity with the names you like, then delete the data source and build the data source with the tables or the views which you really want to use over there. And for the security role, in that case, it had a natural key, and I could also just make it not only read only, but also import the data. Just also forgot almost the summary for the queries and the images. In the staging table, if you want to have it in the resource folder, then also add an additional field, file name. In the case, what I just showed you is regenerating the staging table, but there was also an option for update the staging table. If you added the file name, or if you change the container to a string field in your staging table, then ensure you will not use the regeneration, as it will regenerate including that container field, and you have to do the modifications again. So if you have already that container field converted and the file name, then only use the update option and not the regeneration. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm curious if there are any questions in the meeting chat or probably from someone else.
Thank you, Andre. So yes, we have one question in the chat. So the question is, when to use wizard or manual process for the creation of entity?
Well,
So
actually, yeah.
Please
actually, when you want to create a new data entity, in that case, I would suggest to always use the wizard, just even if the table is not available, because at least you can't create an entity really from scratch. The only thing you can do is duplicate an existing entity, but in that case, you also have to duplicate the security privileges. And you have to duplicate the staging table and also ensure that all the references are correct. So if you initially are using the wizard, then it will create the correct data entity, the correct privileges, and the correct staging table. And then just, depending on the requirements, remove all data sources and start from scratch. Or when you can use the correct table, then just continue with your properties and probably some coding.
Yes, thank you for that, Andre. There is one more question. So the question is, it's from Kamesh. I have an OData entity. I have an data entity where it uses virtual field, but the import is very slow. Is there any way of handling it?
Actually, you can try to use the SQL option for the computed column. If that's not helping, and he really needs to have some coding on the data entity itself, that will convert into a row by row execution, which could be indeed a bit slower, sometimes really slow. Initially try to use the computed column variant. If that's not working out, then try to see if you can limit some coding or probably optimize certain parts where you can sometimes be a bit smarter, but that really depends on the scenario. But sometimes when you, if there's really the need for X++ logic, then there's a price to pay. That's for sure.
Okay, all right. And then again, there is a follow-up question on that. Please give me a tip how to understand more on data entity. Maybe some references from your side.
Well, that's a quite broad question.
Yes.
To learn more, it's just it is about some experience. So what's available or not. For example, what I did not tell today is for example also how to deal with the date time effective tables. There are a lot of examples in the system which are using it, and namely in the HRM features that they really went wild with making everything date effective. So a lot of also data entities which are using it. So if you have certain requirements, in that case, look at existing entities, but also look for probably some documentation or blogs outside. And if you can't find it, then just use the Dynamics community to ask a question. And I'm just participating on that one as a volunteer almost daily. So there are more people also looking at all those questions and trying to help and answer the questions you have.
Yeah, that's very true, Andre. And thank you for those insights. Any more questions, folks? Maybe if you want to have a one-to-one conversation, we still have some time left. You can raise your hand.
Andre, is it possible for you to share your blog link in the chat window so that team can understand?
To my blog site, yes, that's possible.
Yeah.
Be this one. And if you're interested, I can also share the PowerPoint slides with you. Not sure if that should be done in the meeting chat or separately by email.
I think that makes really sense to me, Andre, because people will follow that step-by-step guide that you have created. Because I personally haven't seen any sort of these type of detailed documentation on docs.right. Right? So maybe
That's correct, yes.
if you can provide that, that would really help. And I think many folks in a Dynamics 365, maybe in a Dynamics AX and FNO background, they have grown up in their ladder by looking at you and your blogs and all those what you do for a community, right? So hats off to you, Andre, and really I appreciate your support.
Yeah, thank you. There's one thing I have to admit here. The examples I created today with the security role, that's an automatic role assignment for the users. I tried to do it correctly, also with a reference table to the security role. However, I got an error in the PEEP version of 10.023, complaining that the system was asking for additional properties on the join, which could not be entered by the user themselves. So that's something I will try to figure out this week, or contact Microsoft. There might be a bug in it.
Okay, thank you for your kind gesture, Andre. I think I already make a note of this. So in case if attendees found any sort of challenges, I will try to pass on this message to them that this is the issue with the 10.0.23.
Yeah, and if you try to create entities and you get stuck, just reach out. Go to the community.dynamics.com and you can ask your questions. And a lot of volunteers are really willing to help everyone out.
Yeah, sure, Andre. I must say a very precise and informative session, Andre. The way you jumped between the presentations and demo made our concepts more clear on data entity. Definitely all of us got a lot of learn from this session. Thank you once again for sharing your expert knowledge to the community as you always do, and it is really appreciable. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we appreciate deeply, Andre. Thank you very much.
I'll say thanks for organizing and wish you all the best. And I will also just stay a bit longer in the listen only mode.
Thank you.
Sure, Andre.